This small wooden boat doesn't look like much, but the shipyard that built her doesn't exist anymore. Hasn't for decades. The slipway is gone. The sheds are gone. Most of the men who work there are gone too. And according to the hull number on this plate, this boat was the very last one they ever built before the doors closed for good. Not the most famous boat they made. Not the biggest. Just the last. Which means everything we do to this hull, every plank, every rivet, every repair, we're not just restoring a boat. We're restoring the final piece of evidence that this shipyard and the craft it practiced ever existed at all. If we get this wrong, there's no version of this boat anywhere else to compare it to. No sister ship. No second chance. This is it. We didn't go looking for this boat. It found us, in the roundabout way these things usually happen, through a phone call from a man clearing out his late father's property. He told us there was an old wooden boat in a shed that hadn't been opened in years, and before he sold the land, he wanted someone who'd actually appreciate it to take a look, rather than have it bulldozed along with everything else. When we got there, the shed door hadn't been opened in so long it had to be pried rather than slid. Inside, under a collapsed tarp and years of dust, sat a small wooden vessel, maybe 22 feet, simple lines, clearly built for utility rather than show, the kind of boat that worked for a living rather than sat pretty in a harbor. What caught our attention wasn't the hull shape. It was the small brass builder's plate, tarnished nearly black, bolted near the stern. We cleaned just enough of it to read a shipyard name neither of us recognized immediately, a hull number, and a year. That sent us straight to research mode before we'd even finished looking at the rest of the boat. A quick search told us the shipyard had closed decades ago. Not sold. Not merged. Closed. With the property eventually repurposed, the slipway filled in. Nothing physically remaining of a yard that had once employed dozens of skilled tradesmen. That raised an obvious question we couldn't ignore. If the yard is completely gone, how many boats did they actually build? And is it possible this is one of the last ones, maybe even the very last one, before the doors shut forever? That question is what turned this from nice old boat we're restoring into something we needed to take much more seriously. Finding information about a shipyard that's been closed for decades, with no surviving company records that we could easily access, meant doing the kind of detective work that doesn't show up in a quick search. We started with local historical societies, the kind of organizations that often hold on to exactly this sort of regional industrial history when nobody else thinks to. It took several calls and a few dead ends, but eventually we connected with a local historian who had spent years informally documenting the yard's history as a personal passion project, recognizing that almost nobody else was doing it. He had something we didn't expect. A partial build ledger, water-damaged but legible in sections, that had been saved by a former employee's family decades ago and eventually donated to the Historical Society's small archive. Going through that ledger page by page, cross-referencing hull numbers against the plate on our boat, we found her, listed near the very end of the recorded entries, with a notation that simply read, "Final hull, yard closing." There was no fanfare in that entry. No special notes about it being historic or significant. Just a date, a hull number, and a brief description, the kind of entry that's identical to every other boat in that ledger. Except this is the last one anybody ever wrote down. We dug further into why the yard closed at all. The historian explained what we've heard in different forms at nearly every old shipyard site we've researched: changing economics. Cheaper boats built elsewhere. A workforce that was aging out without enough young tradesmen coming in to replace them. The slow, undramatic decline that doesn't make headlines, it just quietly ends. According to local recollection, when the yard closed, there was no grand final ceremony. The skilled craftsmen who'd spent their careers there simply finished what was on the slipway, and then didn't come back to start anything new. This hull, the one sitting in our workshop, may have been the very last thing those hands ever built together as a team. We tried to find out more about the workers themselves, hoping to potentially connect with descendants who might want to know their relatives' final professional work still existed. The historian had a few names from the ledger's margin notes. Workers occasionally signed off sections they'd personally completed, a practice some smaller yards used for quality accountability. 2 names appeared near our boat's entry. We don't know with certainty if these were definitely the men who built this exact hull, but they were almost certainly among the very last workers employed at the yard. This changed how we thought about the entire project. We weren't just restoring wood and fasteners. We were potentially restoring the last physical work of skilled craftsmen whose careers and whose trade itself at this location ended the moment they put down their tools on this boat. Step 1. Documentation before anything else. Before touching a single board, we documented everything. Every joint, every fastening pattern, every construction detail that might tell us something about how this yard built boats. Because if this really was their final hull, the construction techniques on display here might be the last physical record of methods that otherwise exist only in memory or in incomplete written accounts. We photographed construction details most restoration projects wouldn't bother capturing this thoroughly: frame spacing, fastening patterns, even small idiosyncrasies in how planks were scarfed together, because we suspected some of these details might be genuinely unique to this yard's particular methods. Step 2. Structural assessment. The hull was in better shape than we initially feared, likely because the boat had spent its working life in fairly mild conditions before being stored, dry, in that shed for the better part of 2 decades. The biggest issues were dried-out fastenings, several sprung planks from the wood shrinking over the dry years, and surface checking across most exposed wood surfaces. Step 3. Addressing the planking. Wooden hulls that dry out for extended periods often develop gaps between planks as the wood shrinks. Rather than aggressively forcing everything back together, which risks cracking already stressed wood, we used a slower, traditional approach: controlled rehydration through careful, gradual moisture introduction, allowing the wood to swell back closer to its original dimensions over several weeks rather than days. This is not a fast process, and it tested everyone's patience. But rushing wood back into shape is one of the most common ways restorers accidentally destroy boats that could otherwise have been saved. Step 4. Refastening. Once the wood had stabilized, we addressed fastenings that had worked loose. We matched the original fastening style as closely as we could determine from our documentation phase, choosing to replicate the yard's specific approach rather than simply using whatever modern fastener would be easiest. This mattered more on this project than most. If these techniques genuinely represent a now extinct shipyard signature methods, replacing them with generic modern approaches would have quietly erased exactly the details that made this restoration historically meaningful in the first place. Step 5. The unexpected discovery. About midway through the restoration, while removing an interior structural member that had cracked beyond repair, we found something tucked into a void behind it. A small scrap of paper, brittle and partially deteriorated, with handwriting that was barely legible. We could make out a partial date and what appeared to be initials, but not much else. It's impossible to say for certain who left it there or what it originally said in full. Whether it was a deliberate message, a discarded shop note that fell into the structure during construction, or something else entirely, we simply don't know. We're preserving it carefully and treating it as part of the boat's history rather than guessing at meaning we can't verify. Step 6. The setback. About 5 weeks into the project, during the rehydration phase, one of the garboard planks that we believed was structurally sound developed a split we hadn't anticipated, likely a pre-existing stress fracture that the moisture reintroduction revealed rather than caused. This meant pausing the rehydration schedule on that section, sourcing matching timber, and carefully replacing the plank without disturbing the slow rehydration happening everywhere else on the hull, a delicate balancing act that added nearly 2 weeks to our timeline. Step 7. Finishing. For the exterior finish, we again leaned on documentation rather than convenience, identifying finishing techniques and materials consistent with what a working yard of that size and era would have realistically used, rather than defaulting to whatever modern marine finish happened to be sitting on our shelf. When we finally stepped back from this boat, what struck us wasn't how good she looked, though she does look good. It was the quiet weight of what she represents. This is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, the final hull built by a shipyard whose name now exists mostly in a partial water-damaged ledger sitting in a small regional archive. The men who built her likely never knew, in that moment, that they were building the last thing they'd ever build together at that yard. They just came to work and did the job the way they'd always done it, one more time. We didn't restore this boat to make her faster or flashier or more valuable. We restored her because she's the last physical sentence in a story that otherwise has no ending written down anywhere. If anyone watching this has a connection to this shipyard, a family member who worked there, a memory, a photograph, anything. We would genuinely love to hear from you. This boat deserves a fuller story than the one we've managed to piece together so far. The yard is gone. The slipway is gone. But this boat is still here. And now, she'll stay that way for a long time to come.